Welcome to my shop. The lighting is not always the greatest because it's an outdoor shop, but boy do I have a view. I want to talk today about back saws. A back saw is a saw that has a thin plate, a finely set tooth, a little bit finer number of teeth, like 12 points per inch or 12 teeth per inch and above, and a folded or sometimes a cut spine. In other words, there's a slight cut in the spine instead of the spine being folded metal. But a spine on the back of the blade that stiffens a thin blade so that you can cut with it and do fine joinery work. But back saws can be confusing because this is a back saw, this is a back saw, and this is a back saw. Sounds simple, right? Well, not really, because this is a dovetail saw. This could be a Carcass saw or a Sash saw. And this is a smaller Tenon saw. They come really big and really deep. Okay, but for my needs, this is all the Tenon saw I need. But this is a Tenon saw. But they're all back saws. And the thing of it is we get really confusing information on these saws because no one understands or agrees on what's what. But what you have to understand is that these saws got their name when tradesmen were using these saws. They were using hand tools to build houses or furniture with. And what would happen is, these are Western saws. I've spoken about this before. And I have a deep and abiding respect and love for Western saws because I can modify the tooth line, I can modify the number of teeth, the type of teeth, I can modify how aggressive this is or how non-aggressive this cuts. I can modify how wide the curve it cuts is. I can modify the type of teeth, like I can go a cross-cut tooth, or I can file a rip-cut tooth. I can do all kinds of things to this saw, and I can find this saw and type of saw, a back saw, in a variety of lengths and heights to do different jobs, so that if I have a saw that is tall enough and long enough, but the teeth are wrong, I can change the teeth on this saw to do whatever job I need. That's the crux of why back saws can be confusing, because everybody's got an opinion about what makes a particular type of back saw suitable for a specific job. Like this saw, for instance, you remember I said this could be a Carcass saw or a Sash saw. Okay? Well, what's a Carcass saw? A Carcass saw is a saw that's cut cross-cut, although nowadays they offer them in rip as well, which confuses things even more. But a Carcass saw is a cross-cut filed saw that makes cross-grain cuts to cut joints like tenons and other joints that you would use to join the carcass of a piece of furniture, the frame of a piece of furniture together. Okay? Most of those cuts are going to be cross cuts. So they took a small back saw that's appropriate for the kind of things that they are building. They might use a really big saw if they're building really big things. But for fine joinery, they chose a fairly short in height saw, back saw, filed it cross-cut, and used it for cutting the joints in carcasses of furniture. Okay, so they called it a carcass saw. So what's a sash saw? Well, a sash saw is a saw that was used in building homes, and the sash of a window, they would file a small back saw with a cross-cut tooth and use it to cut the sashes when building and framing in windows. And so that saw became a sash saw. Same thing with the tenon saw. There's a joint in furniture making called a tenon. This saw would be used to cut that tenon. They would cut like that, and then they would take the saw yeah, I didn't quite get it all the way down because I didn't lay it out. That's all right. Cut my finger open. That's what happens when you have a sharp saw. It'll just have to bleed. It'll be all right. Let me cut it. I'm just cutting a quick tenon joint, and it's not perfect. I didn't lay anything out or anything of the sort. Let me take that just a little bit further. On that side. And they would just take the saw, cut across the grain on that sheet. And cut a tenon. I know it's lopsided, but they would cut a tenon that would go into a mortise in a piece of wood. So they called that a tenon saw. Now, there are a lot of people that would say, well, a tenon saw should be a crosscut saw because you're cutting that shoulder there. And that shoulder is a really important part of the cut. But, in my opinion, it should be rip because that's a whole lot more wood to cut there than that little bit of shoulder. And if my saw is fine enough, you see this is a rip cut saw. But if you look at that shoulder line, a tiny little bit of work with a chisel in that shoulder line, and it's perfectly fine because of the number of teeth and the very small amount of set that's on this saw. So that's how they got their name. What it was people chose to call it whatever it was that they used it for. Why? Well, when you're in the middle of a busy day and you've got your apprentice with you and you need a saw that you left in your toolbox, you're over here on the job site, but you're over here and the toolbox is way over there. You send the gopher and you say, go get my tenon saw. And he knows which saw that was because it's the saw that you're using to cut tenons. Go get my Sash saw. Go get my Carcass saw. So I've said that to say this. That's how they got their name. It was because they named it after the job they did with that saw, predominantly did with that saw. They were all back saws. But the dovetail saw, they cut dovetails with. The Sash or the Carcass saw, they did that kind of work with it. And the tenon saw, they did tenon work and larger work with it. Okay? That required rip cuts, that required cross cuts, that kind of deal. And so, don't get so caught up because what will happen is you'll see all these beautiful shiny saws that all of these guys are using, and you'll see guys that, and I'm not picking on him, I learn a lot from him. Rob Cosman, he's got like a line of saws that are like $300 a piece or whatever. Okay, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. If they're good quality saws, they're probably worth the money. But you've got people also that were trained a certain way to use certain saws for certain things. And then you've got other people that broke with that kind of tradition or that kind of convention and used things in different ways. And so you can get to a point if you're watching all these guys with like 5 different tenons or 5 different back saws, okay, thinking that you need all of these saws. I need every one of those. I need a Sash saw. I need a Carcass saw. I need this saw. I need it. Well, like take a dovetail saw for instance. Do you cut dovetails? Because you don't really need one if you don't. Now, something like this would probably work just fine. What I would do probably is use like in combination, if I was cutting tenons, I would take a tenon saw and cut rip cuts for that for the tenon itself, and then for the shoulder I'd take my dovetail saw, which has a much finer cut, although it is still rip, and cut this shoulder off with that, instead of worrying about having a crosscut saw, because none of my saws are cut crosscut. None of them are file crosscut. I don't have a need for them. I probably will look for a small saw like this that I can turn into a Carcass saw. But for the time being, rip is all I use. And that's the point I'm making is you need to look at what you do, and then you decide what kind of saw, particularly with back saws, what size, what depth, what length, what kind of tooth configuration that you need to do the kind of jobs that you do. You do the kind of woodworking that you do. You don't have to own every saw that they make. And if you understand why the saws are called what they're called, well then you can make an informed decision on the kind of saw or saws that you need for the woodworking that you do. Thanks for watching. Talk to you later.